Here's the problem with money. Most people just don't have enough to do what they need to do. But if you're in agriculture and you don't have a steady paycheck, it takes even longer to get the money that you need to buy the things that you have to have so that your agriculture can be productive. That limits your options. Fortunately, we have these things called banks, and banks do a wonderful job of loaning money to people who don't have any money. So folks who are short of cash can go to a bank and get a loan that'll tide them over until they have the cash, whether that's because a paycheck is coming or because your crops haven't come in yet and you'll be able to sell them later. But nothing is free, so banks are always going to make sure you put something up on a tangible level so that if you don't pay back your loan, they still get something for it. So here's where a bank really functions. The bank takes cash and deposits it and holds it and keeps it safe. It then turns around and loans that money back out again, though. Most banks will hold on to about 10% of what you give them. The rest of it goes out into circulation. So a lot of banks don't have a lot of cash. They have the promise of cash, but they don't have actual cash. Now, back in the 1800s, it's important to remember that banks are local institutions. They don't generally do business at a national level. They don't even do business at a state level. They're limited to the business they can conduct with the people who live a certain amount of miles around them. And it's got to be convenient. So there are lots of banks within a county and within a state, and there are thousands of banks within the United States. But all of them have very little cash and a lot of the promise of cash, and that's a problem. So our farmer can't pay back his loan, so the bank took his collateral, and they've taken the collateral from everybody who can't pay back this loan. So an interesting problem has now arisen. The banks don't have a lot of cash, and they no longer have the promise of cash. Now they have stuff. But who's going to have the money to buy the stuff from the bank if all the people in the area don't have money? So let's pause here for a moment and take a look at two possible questions. Take a second, write down what you think, talk with a friend, see what they think. Do you guys agree? Do you disagree? And then we'll talk about it as a group. And now we have the problem that leads to the panic. You're going to show up to your bank and you're going to say, "I'd like to take out my money, please." And the bank's going to say, "Sorry, no, I don't have any." And you're going to say, "What? What do you mean you don't have any? I gave you my money." And the bank said, "Right, but I loaned it out. If you come back next week, I'll have more." In the meantime, enough people show up at the bank saying, "Hey, we want our money." And the bank keeps saying, "Sorry, no." People panic because their money's gone. Their hard-earned money is gone. And what are they going to do now? That word spreads, and it starts getting in a bigger and bigger circle until every bank is faced with a whole herd of people coming in and saying, "We want our money." But the banks don't have it, so all they can keep saying is, "Sorry, no." And that means that eventually the bank is going to close because what little money they have comes out of the bank and goes into the pockets of the people who got there first. And so we end up with this panic and banks start to close. So here's the problem in short. People need to deposit their money in a bank. If they can do that, then the bank can make loans. And that means that people get more money that they can deposit into the bank. So you have to have a bank so that people can buy stuff. Otherwise, people can't buy stuff. If you take the bank out of the equation, then there's no money to deposit, and the whole financial system stops. In 1819, that's what happens. So this problem is exactly the same. In 1818, cotton was selling for 32.5 cents per pound. So everybody who was growing cotton got loans expecting that that's what they were going to make in 1819. But in 1819, London decided that it wanted to get cotton from India and not from the United States, and the market flooded. And so cotton was selling for 14 cents per pound. So people couldn't pay their loans back, banks didn't have enough cash, and the whole system collapsed. On top of that, state banks had all invested in land, thinking that land prices would go up so that people would borrow more money to buy more land. And so the problem is that the people didn't have any money to buy land because their earlier source of wealth had dried up too. So land values collapsed. Like plummeted. So there's no money to buy more land. There's no value for the land. Finally, the last step is that it was discovered that the federal government, the National Bank of the United States, also had a problem. Turns out people had been embezzling from the Bank of the United States. To embezzle means to steal money from. So the national bank doesn't have any cash to distribute to the state banks. The local banks don't have cash, the state banks don't have cash, the national bank doesn't have cash. The whole banking system ground to a halt of the United States. It became impossible to get loans. There is no hard currency in circulation. There's no paper currency in circulation. And people stop trusting banks. So they begin hoarding their money. It, on the whole, takes 5 years for this problem to get better. And as a result, all kinds of things start to change in America. And that puts us directly on the path to civil war.